In this session, we will focus on the economic consideration of PV power plants. That means we'll be looking at the economics and the financial aspects of photovoltaic power plants. The economics in the field of photovoltaics can be discussed at several levels. Such levels can include the levels of the consumer, the manufacturer's level, the PV installer's level or technology level. And then we can go ahead and compare all of these with other sources at grid scale. So the first question you want to ask yourself is how do we define payback period? The payback period in finance is defined as the length of time required to recover the cost of an investment. So when you make an investment in PV or any energy source, as the case may be, but here we are talking about PV. When you make an investment in PV, how long will it take you for you to recover the cost of that investment? That is what we refer to as payback period when we talk about finance. So what you will see here is that this red line represents an investment cost, and then we have represented these yellow arrow with the returns. Payback period mathematically can be defined as investment cost divided by the returns per year. Or you may simply want to call it investment cost divided by the annual returns. In the case of PV system user, the initial investment in terms of system cost is recovered over years as the PV system offsets the electricity bills. So when we have a user that installs a PV to supply energy or electrical energy to the appliances used in the house, what usually happens is that instead of the user collecting or taking or consuming energy from the grid, the utility grid, they consume their energy from the PV system. They get their energy from their PV systems. So it simply means that on a regular basis, instead of paying electricity bills on a monthly basis or on regular intervals, because they no longer get the energy from the utility grid, they would not pay that electricity bill. Why? Because they are getting their energy from the PV system. So they are saving the utility bill payment because of the electrical energy they are getting from their PV system. So over time, over the course of 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, the amount of electricity bills saved, not paid, offset, will be calculated, and that will amount to the amount that has been recovered from the investment made in the PV installation. For example, let's say we have an installation cost for a PV system of 1 kilowatt peak by a user, and the PV electricity per year is 800 euros. That would mean that the amount of electricity consumed from the PV costs an average of 800 euros annually. And then the annual consumption from the utility grid is about 2,000 euros. Okay, so the installation cost is 4,000 euros. Electricity consumed from PV system is about 800 euros. That's the amount of energy consumed from PV is 800 euros. And the amount of energy consumed from the utility grid, or that can be consumed from the utility grid, is 2,000 euros per year. The amount of electricity that can be consumed from the utility grid is about 2,000 euros per year. If we look at this scenario, this is what we will find. How will this scenario play out in the next 5 years? Investment will be recovered in that 5 years. How? Here is it. This is the installation cost. We have all the costs written on this vertical axis to the left. So you can see we have our red color, and then we have the red line, and then we have the yellow line. The red line represents the investment, like we mentioned earlier, while the yellow line represents the returns. Okay, So this is the investment cost, 4,000 euros. In the first year, 800 euros worth of electricity is consumed from the PV. In the second year, another 800 euros will be consumed from the PV. So it will take 5 years to consume 4,000 euros from the PV. Now, these 4,000 euros consumed from the PV would normally have been paid to the utility grid of that particular region. But because we are collecting and consuming this energy from the PV, it will not be paid to the utility grid. That amount will be saved by the customer or by the user. And therefore, this can be accounted for the amount recovered from the investment of the PV. So if this continues for 3 years, that would be about 2,400 saved. If it continues for 4 years, that would be about 3,200 euros saved. If it continues for 5 years, that would be about 4,000 euros saved. And that would have actually met the exact cost incurred by installing the PV. So if this continues for 10 years, that's about 8,000 euros that would have been saved. And that simply means that PV in the long run has more advantages than it has in the short run. Over a period of time, one would recover the amount invested in installing the PV, and then we can keep saving more and more and more as the years go by. So you might want to calculate that over the lifetime of the PV, which may be assumed to be 20 years or 25 years or 30 years, how much savings would have been made by this user. You just multiply the number of years by 800 euros. If nothing changes, if all the consumption remains constant and the annual consumption of electricity from the PV remains 800 euros, in 30 years, how much would have been saved by this user? So when you calculate that, that begins to give you a picture, it begins to give you an idea of how important it is to have PV installed in our respective homes. Okay, for PV system, the payback period is usually short, probably 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Payback period is what we usually experience. And after the payback period, all the money saved becomes the users. So this is important. It is important that we have a good understanding of what is going on here, so that we can, be able to demystify any kind of questions that come out of this kind of analysis. So payback period depends on location of implementation of the PV system. Payback period is one of the most important things that the users are concerned about. Also, the installers or the users are concerned about payback period because they want to know how long it will take for them to recover their investment. So in discussing payback period, we want to talk about the factors that actually affect the payback period. What factors make the payback period longer or shorter? Payback period depends on the location of implementation of the system. So when we talk about location, it simply means we are talking about the meteorological conditions of that particular location. We're talking about the sun. Okay, the sunnier the location, the greater the PV yield and the faster the payback period. The savings by the PV system not only depends on the PV yield, but also on the grid electricity cost. So finally, the initial PV system costs are also a major factor in deciding the payback period. So when you are investing or when you are installing your PV system, the cost of installing that PV system would also affect the payback period. And then this payback period can also be affected by the grid electricity cost, because the grid electricity cost will determine the amount that you are saving on an annual basis, and that would affect how long it will take to recover your investment. Invariably, that would mean it also affects your payback period. Payback calculations can become more complex as more parameters are factored in. If we are considering a significant period of time, it is a practice to take into account the time value of money, because the value of money does not remain static. Inflation and a lot of other factors come into play, and then the value of money in a particular year will not be the exact value of that money in 2, 3, 4, 5 years to come. For example, 1,000 euros today will have a different buying or purchasing power 10 years from now. So there are a lot of policy-based factors that we have to put into consideration. For example, subsidies, feed-in tariffs, and so on and so forth can affect the initial investments and savings of a user. What are feed-in tariffs? At the consumer level, feed-in tariff is the rate at which a consumer is paid for the electricity that grid-connected PV system contributes to the local grid of that particular region. For example, like we said, this is like the grid, local grid for a particular region. So when your PV generates electricity and that PV contributes some electricity to the local grid, the amount or the rate at which that consumer or user is paid for contributing such electricity to the local grid is what we refer to as the feed-in tariff. Okay, so we have the gross feed-in tariff, we have the net feed-in tariff. These are two terms that we have to pay attention to. Okay, gross feed-in tariffs are paid for all electricity the panels produce, irrespective of the domestic electricity consumption of the consumers, while the net feed-in tariff promises a higher rate for the surplus electricity fed into the grid after domestic use of the consumer is subtracted. This simply means that the gross will pay attention to all the electricity generated by the PV, irrespective of what you use as a consumer. It simply means that as a consumer, whether you use electricity or you do not use electricity from your PV, as long as that PV is generating electricity, the gross feed-in tariff accounts for total production, or the rate is based on that total production of the PV. Whereas when we talk about the net feed-in tariff, we are talking about what is left as surplus after you have used electricity as a user that has PV installed in his or her home. Okay, so what you have surplus is very important to the local grid or to the utility grid managers of your locality, of your area, of your region. Okay, and they factor all of this in to determine the rate at which you are going to be paid. For example, the net feed-in tariffs have higher rate for surplus electricity. That means when you generate electricity and then you have used some and you only have excess, what you have excess will actually carry a higher rate. You will pay more for having excess after you have used some from what you generated. But if you are not using what you generate at all and you are only focusing on what you produce, the rate you will be paid at which the consumer will be paid, or the user will be paid, or the generator, the owner of the PV generator will be paid, will be lower compared to if some have been used from the generated electricity. Another important term to talk about when discussing the economics of PV systems is the levelized cost of electricity, usually abbreviated as LCOE. It is the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity produced by a power generation project. It is usually used to compare the lifetime cost of projects based on various power sources. We have different kinds of power sources. We have fossil fuels, which would include the coal-fired power plants. We have the natural gas or gas-fired power plants. We also have the oil-fired power plants. We have the nuclear power plants, the wind plants, the offshore wind plants. We have the solar thermal, and then we have the PV itself. We have quite a number of power generating sources. However, when we talk about levelized cost of electricity, it helps us compare the lifetime cost of different kinds of projects based on all these power sources that we are talking about. Okay, so as an example, when you look at the fossil fuels here, the pink color represents the fixed O and M cost. O and M represents operation and maintenance. So what you will see on all those pink colors, or each of those power sources represents fixed operation and maintenance cost. And then when you look at the green colors, that is levelized capital cost. When you look at the yellow color, that is variable operation and maintenance cost. And then we have the transmission investment as the turquoise blue that you can see here. So for each of these power sources, you will see that the costs are not the same. They vary depending on the power sources that we are talking about. And right on this vertical column, you can see we have the estimated LCOE for each of these power sources. Okay, for example, the LCOE for fossil fuels is at $100 per megawatt hour. You can see that the levelized cost of electricity for solar thermal is higher compared to levelized cost of electricity for fossil fuel. You would also see that the levelized cost of electricity for a project for PV is higher than that of wind, but lower than that of solar thermal, also lower than that of the offshore wind. It's also a bit higher than nuclear and fossil fuel. So when you look at all of these power sources, you can compare their levelized cost of electricity. You can know which one is higher, which one is lower over a period of time. The concept of LCOE allocates the cost of an energy plant across its useful lifetime to give an effective price per kilowatt hour. It is similar to averaging the upfront cost of production over a long period of time. So it is important that you know that the levelized cost of electricity, the LCOE, it gives you a cost of an energy plant across its useful lifetime. For example, PV has a lifetime of about 20 to 30 years. So when we talk about the LCOE of PV plants, we are talking about a cost allocated to that PV plant that gives us an idea, of the cost of that energy plant or that PV plant across its useful lifetime. It is usually given per kilowatt hour. Cost of energy. Energy is measured in kilowatt hours, power is measured in kilowatt. So when we talk about LCOE, we're talking about this cost per kilowatt hour throughout the useful lifetime of that project, that energy source. In simple terms, if we know the annual PV yield for the system over its lifetime and the accompanying system cost, the LCOE can be found by using the expression or mathematical formula given below. As you can see, we have the LCOE given with this formula. You can see what each of the symbols used in this expression represents. We have R or I. This R can also mean this I, the small letter I, and that would mean discount rate or interest rate. Then we have the AT, which means the total annual cost in a year. We have the ET, which means the annual energy yield. We have the I naught, capital I naught, which means the initial investment in the power plant. Okay, so this would represent summation of A divided by 1 plus I all raised to power T. Okay, and then this T represents the time. It represents the time. For example, if we're talking about 1 year, it means we are saying T is equal to 1. If T is equal to 2, that means we're referring to 2 years. If T is equal to 3, we're referring to 3 years. And this capital N here would represent the lifetime of the particular power plant in question. So if we are talking about PV, in this case, it simply means we can say that N is equal to 25. So we're gonna have T. This is gonna give us an iteration for T equal to 1, T equal to 2, T equal to 3, T equal to 4, 5, right until we get to T equal to 25. Okay, and then we'll keep get those values like that. R is a factor used to discount future costs and translating them into present value. Okay, so we have the discount rate as the R. It can also be the interest rate. Okay, based on the site of the PV generation and the cost of materials, the LCOE of PV projects could vary. The discount rates used for evaluation will have an impact on the LCOE value. So if the discount rate is high, it will have a great impact on the LCOE value. If it is also low, it will have a great impact on the LCOE value. For the power producer, the LCOE is a valuable indicator of the cost competitiveness of a certain energy technology. The LCOE is the price point indicator. That simply means this helps the power producer, whoever is producing or generating, electricity from the power source. It helps them to know exactly how much they should sell their energy in order to be able to generate profit or make profit. Okay? The policies structured around PV energy, like feed-in tariffs, subsidies, and other kinds of incentives, such as green cards and so on and so forth, all play a role in determining grid power prices. This is very important. So at the end of the day, when we decide and say, okay, when the government or when a power producer decides on the amount they want to sell their electricity, all of these values like feed-in tariffs and subsidies and incentives, different kinds of incentives, they affect the final price of that energy. Grid parity is one of the most fundamental concepts when we talk about energy technology and when we are comparing such energy technology with other available technologies. Grid parity is the situation at which the PV power can be generated at a cost, a levelized cost that is equal to the power price from the conventional electric grid. When we say conventional electric grid, we are referring to the oil, the coal, and gas-fired power plants. So those conventional electric grid, which are the most popular so far, the cost of electricity from those grid, when we have it, and then compare it with the cost of electricity from our renewable energy source or other kinds of energy source that we have in question. We talk about grid parity when both prices are equal. When the cost of renewable energy or other sources have reduced, has come down, has been beaten down, has reduced to the cost of the conventional electric grid energy price. When they are equal, then we say we have grid parity. Under normal circumstances, the renewable energy technologies that we have in the current world and a couple of other energy sources that are coming up, they have the electricity, the price of electricity from those sources are more expensive than the price of electricity from the grid. So until we're able to beat the prices down and make them equal, we cannot say we have grid parity. And grid parity is one of the major concepts that the world is driving towards, especially when we talk about renewable energy technologies. And PV is one of the renewable energy technologies that we do have. So this grid parity could be generalized to other renewable energy technologies as well. I just talked about that. There is a significant difference, one significant difference between PV and other renewable technologies like the wind turbines, the hydro dams, and so on and so forth. Now, here's the difference. Compared to other sources like the wind turbines and hydro dams, PV can be scaled down to the level of a single module. And this talks about modularity. This means that the PV is now effectively competing with the retail grid price, which conventionally includes other costs like transmission, distribution, and so on and so forth. So, compared to the wholesale price, PV grid parity for retail grid prices can be reached faster, especially when we are looking at what the wind turbines can do and what the hydro dams and other sources can do. So as capital costs decline with increasing volumes, PV power is expected to be cheaper. All right, the more of a commodity you produce, the cheaper you want to sell. Because when you mass produce, the cost of production would reduce, and then the cost of selling one unit of that product would also reduce. When PV first came into being, the cost of installing PV was very high, and the price of energy from PV also was high because the cost of installation was high. Why? Because at that point, people had not risen up to understand the value inherent in installing PV. So very few people were actually installing PVs. People were not knowledgeable about PV. We have very few of such units globally, and even at local presence, even locally. So manufacturers were not producing many of these products. Hence, the few products produced were expensive and the cost of energy from them was high. However, as time unfolded and people gained more knowledge about the photovoltaic PV systems, many more units have been produced, many more units have been sold, and then the volume of production, the volume of installation has really increased. And these has driven down the cost of installation and of course driven down the cost of energy from such power sources. And this is going to continue over time, and we should expect the value of the price of energy from PV to be cheaper as the volume increases. On the other hand, the cost of fossil fuels due to availability and emission costs are expected to rise, and they are already rising. Thereby, this will continue to increase the conventional grid costs. So if this happens, it means that very soon the cost of PV will be cheaper. Cost of energy from PV will be cheaper than the cost of energy from the conventional energy sources. Because for the conventional energy sources, the availability is no longer there. There are sayings and myths that the conventional energy sources are becoming scarce. And the more they become scarce, the less available they are for energy generation. And if this continues, it simply means the price will continue to go up. So we keep our fingers crossed, and then we'll see how the future unfolds. Whether PV will be cheaper and way cheaper than PV energy will be cheaper and way cheaper than the energy we obtain from our conventional sources. Again, PV doesn't have emissions, so no emission costs are attached to PV. And then the conventional sources, because of the emissions and the threat that this causes to the environment, there are costs associated to these emissions, and this also increases the cost of energy from such power plants. So when we talk about levelized cost, we have to quickly look at the factors that affect it. The site location is one of the key factors. Sites having more sun hours will have lower levelized cost of electricity. True grid parity is when PV power prices would fall below grid prices without any subsidies. This is very important. Currently, many governments are providing subsidy for PV installers, and this makes it easy. This makes it more attractive for the installers to keep installing PVs, or for many more people to be interested in installing PV. Some of these subsidies come in form of feed-in tariffs, they come in form of net metering, they come in form of some incentives given to installation of such technologies. Now, these subsidies come at a cost. Okay, someone is paying for it, the government is paying for it. So we are saying that true grid parity is when we can actually compare the price of PV energy without subsidy with the price of energy from other conventional sources. Because with subsidy, the prices are generally definitely going to be low. But without subsidy, we can then know the true price of the PV energy and then compare such with other conventional sources. So grid parity is actually very rare, especially solar grid parity without subsidies. Solar grid parity without subsidies are actually very rare. The grid parity is a very important indicator of the usefulness of the renewable energy technology. The closer a technology is to grid parity, the easier it will be for it to be integrated in the energy mix of that particular region. So this simply means when energy sources are actually producing energy at very expensive or high rate, it becomes more difficult to introduce such energy technologies into the energy mix of that particular region. By energy mix, we are saying that for a particular region, what are the energy sources that are used in generating energy for the entire region? Okay, how do they combine these sources? How much percentage of a particular energy generating technology is being used compared to other energy generating technologies. For example, do we have just 3 energy sources in our energy mix? Do we have just 3 energy producing technologies in our energy mix? Do we have just fossil fuels? Do we have fossil fuels and renewable energies? If we have fossil fuels, what type of fossil fuels do we have? Do we have just one type of fossil fuel or 2 types of fossil fuel? If we have renewable energies, do we have just wind? Do we have wind and PV? Do we have wind, PV and geothermal providing energy to make up the entire energy we have for that particular region? This is what we refer to as energy mix. For any energy technology to make it into the energy mix, grid parity is one of the main factors that can be used to make that kind of judgment call. So the closer a technology is to grid parity, the closer the cost of energy from that technology is to the cost of energy from the conventional energy sources, the easier it becomes to actually introduce such energy technology in the energy mix for a particular nation or region. With the advancement in technology and the maturity of manufacturing processes, grid parity for solar is expected to be a more popular occurrence in several places around the world. So this brings us to the end of this lesson. The concepts such as grid parity, levelized cost of electricity, payback period, and then the factors affecting the payback period, factors affecting the levelized cost of electricity. These are important details we have to look at and understand critically. In the next lesson, we'll be talking about the environmental impact or considerations of photovoltaic power plants. See you then.